The small town of Maplewood was quiet on Thanksgiving Day, blanketed in a thick layer of fresh snow that sparkled under the pale winter sun. The streets were deserted, save for an occasional car slowly making its way through the icy roads. Most families had retreated indoors hours ago, filling their homes with the warm aroma of roasted turkey, baked pies, and steaming vegetables. Laughter echoed from behind frosted windows as loved ones gathered around tables adorned with candles and hand-woven tablecloths, sharing stories and creating memories. Jack Turner wasn't one of those people. For him, holidays like Thanksgiving often felt bittersweet. He lived alone now, ever since his wife passed away 5 years earlier after a long battle with illness. Since then, life had become a series of routines, working at his mechanic shop during the day, coming home to an empty house at night and trying to keep busy so he wouldn't dwell too much on what he'd lost. His teenage daughter, Emily, used to fill some of the silence, but she was growing up fast. This year, she was spending Thanksgiving with her college friends in another state, leaving Jack to face the holiday by himself. He didn't mind being alone. Not really. Over time, he'd grown accustomed to it. Still, there was always a pang of loneliness that crept in when he saw other families laughing together or heard children playing outside. Holidays seemed to amplify that feeling, no matter how hard he tried to ignore it. So, instead of dwelling on it, Jack decided to make the best of things. He planned to close his garage early, pick up a frozen dinner from the local grocery store, and spend the evening watching old movies on television. It wasn't glamorous, but it was enough for him. As the afternoon light began to fade, Jack wiped his hands on a rag and glanced at the clock hanging above the workbench. It was almost 4 p.m., and the temperature outside was dropping quickly. The wind howled against the metal walls of the garage, rattling tools and sending shivers down his spine. Time to call it a day, he muttered to himself, grabbing his coat from a hook near the door. Just as he was about to lock up, a sharp knock echoed through the room. Startled, Jack turned toward the entrance. Through the frosted glass, he could see the silhouette of someone standing outside, bundled tightly in a heavy jacket. Curious, and slightly annoyed at the interruption, he opened the door to find a family of 4 huddled together, their faces flushed from the cold. A man held open the front of his coat to shield 2 young children, while a woman clutched a scarf tightly around her neck. Behind them, parked awkwardly on the side of the road just a few blocks away, sat a sleek black SUV partially buried in snow. "Please, sir, can you help us?" the man asked, his voice trembling from both the cold and anxiety. "Our car broke, down a little ways back, and we've been stuck out here for over an hour. We don't have cell service, and—" His words trailed off as he gestured helplessly toward the vehicle. Jack frowned, stepping aside to let the family into the warmth of the garage. They looked exhausted, their cheeks red from exposure to the biting wind. The kids, a boy and a girl, who couldn't have been older than 8, clung to each other, wide-eyed and silent. The mother's lips were chapped and her eyes glistened with unshed tears. Something about their desperation struck a chord deep within Jack. He knew all too well what it felt like to be stranded without help, though his experience had come in a different form. "I'm sorry," Jack said gently, rubbing his hands together to warm them, "but I was just about to head home. Fixing a car takes time, especially in this weather." He hesitated, glancing at the clock again. If he stayed to help them, he'd miss his own plans. Not that they were anything special, but still. The thought of giving up even that small comfort weighed heavily on him. The father nodded quickly, understanding Jack's reluctance. "We completely understand if you can't. We're already grateful you opened the door for us, but we're supposed to meet family in the next town over, and the kids are freezing. My wife is pregnant too, and I'm worried about her staying out here much longer." At the mention of pregnancy, Jack's resolve wavered. He glanced at the woman, noticing for the first time the slight swell beneath her coat. She offered him a weak smile, her gratitude evident despite her obvious discomfort. The kids stared up at him with hopeful eyes, their tiny faces framed by woolen hats pulled low over their ears. Sighing, Jack ran a hand through his graying hair. "All right," he said finally, grabbing his toolbox from the corner. "Let me grab my truck and we'll go take a look. But I can't promise anything, it might be something serious." Relief washed over the family's faces as they thanked him profusely. While Jack loaded his equipment into the bed of his tow truck, the family climbed into the cab, grateful for the shelter and warmth. As he drove them back to their stranded SUV, Jack couldn't shake the nagging feeling that helping them would mean sacrificing more than just his evening. Still, he pushed the thought aside. Helping others was what he did best, even if it came at a personal cost. When they arrived at the scene, Jack stepped out into the icy air, surveying the situation. The SUV was partially stuck in a snowbank, its engine silent and unresponsive. Snowflakes swirled around him as he popped the hood, revealing a tangled mess of wires and frozen components. It was going to be a long night. The biting wind whipped through the air as Jack crouched beside the SUV, his breath forming tiny clouds in the frigid evening. The snow crunched under his boots as he leaned over the engine, squinting at the tangled mess of wires and frozen components. The family stood nearby, huddled together for warmth, their eyes fixed on him with a mix of hope and desperation. Jack could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on him, but he pushed it aside. This wasn't the first time he'd been called upon to fix something in less than ideal conditions, though it was certainly one of the coldest. "All right," Jack muttered to himself, grabbing his flashlight from the toolbox. He flicked it on, illuminating the engine bay. At first glance, the problem seemed straightforward. A dead battery, maybe a loose connection, but given the weather, and the fact that the car had been sitting idle for over an hour, there was no telling what other issues might be lurking beneath the surface. "Let's see what we've got here." As he worked, the father approached hesitantly, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat. "Is there anything we can do to help?" he asked, his voice tinged with guilt. "I feel terrible asking you to do this on Thanksgiving of all days." Jack glanced up briefly, offering a reassuring smile. "Don't worry about it. You're not the first person who's needed help on a holiday, and you won't be the last. Besides, I couldn't just leave you out here in this cold." He paused, tapping a wrench lightly against the side of the engine. "If you really want to help, keep an eye on the kids and make sure they stay warm. That's the best thing you can do right now." The man nodded, retreating back to where his wife and children stood shivering near the truck. Jack watched them for a moment. The way the mother wrapped her arms protectively around the two small figures, shielding them from the wind. The sight tugged at something deep inside him, stirring memories he preferred to keep buried. He shook his head, forcing himself to focus on the task at hand. There would be time enough later to reflect. Right now, these people needed him. For the next hour, Jack worked methodically, his gloved hands moving with practiced precision despite the numbing cold. He checked the battery terminals, cleaned away corrosion, and tested the connections. When that didn't solve the problem, he moved on to inspect the alternator and fuel lines, knowing full well that any number of things could have caused the engine to fail. Each step brought its own challenges, especially with the snow continuing to fall and the light fading rapidly. By the time he switched on his portable work lamp, the world around him had grown eerily quiet, save for the occasional gust of wind rattling through the trees. Despite the difficulty of the job, Jack found himself oddly comforted by the rhythm of it. There was something grounding about working with his hands, about focusing on a problem that had a clear solution. It reminded him of simpler times, before life became so complicated. As he tightened a bolt or adjusted a wire, he allowed himself to drift mentally, replaying snippets of conversations he'd had with his late wife. She used to tease him about how he always seemed happiest when he was elbow-deep in grease, fixing someone else's problems instead of dealing with his own. Maybe she was right, but he couldn't deny that helping others gave him a sense of purpose he rarely found elsewhere. At one point, the younger child, a little girl with bright blue eyes, ventured closer, clutching a stuffed rabbit to her chest. She peered curiously at the tools scattered around Jack's feet, her expression somewhere between awe and apprehension. "Are you a superhero?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely audible over the wind. Jack chuckled softly, setting down his wrench. "Not quite," he replied, leaning down to meet her gaze. "But I do try to save the day whenever I can. Think of me as your friendly neighborhood mechanic." Her face lit up at that, and she giggled before darting back to her mother, who smiled apologetically. "Sorry if she's bothering you," the woman said, pulling her daughter close. "She's just fascinated by everything you're doing." "It's no bother at all," Jack assured her, returning to his work. In fact, the child's innocent question had lifted his spirits more than she probably realized. It was easy to forget sometimes that what he did mattered, not just to him, but to the people who relied on him. That thought carried him through the next phase of repairs, even as the temperature continued to drop and his fingers grew stiff with cold. Eventually, the father joined him again, this time holding out a thermos. "We brought some hot cocoa with us," he explained. "It's not much, but I figured you might need it after being out here for so long." Jack accepted the offer gratefully, taking a sip of the steaming liquid. The warmth spread through him instantly, chasing away some of the chill. "Thanks," he said sincerely. "That hits the spot." They fell into an easy conversation as Jack continued working, exchanging stories about their lives and families. The man introduced himself as Richard, explaining that they were traveling from Chicago to visit relatives for the holiday. His wife Sarah chimed in occasionally, sharing anecdotes about their journey and how excited the kids had been to see the Thanksgiving parade on television earlier that morning. Listening to them talk, Jack couldn't help but notice how close-knit they seemed, how effortlessly they supported each other. It was a stark contrast to his own solitary existence, yet it left him feeling oddly content rather than envious. As the hours ticked by, Jack's initial frustration at missing his own plans melted away. Helping this family wasn't just about fixing a car, it was about giving them peace of mind, ensuring they could continue their journey safely. And though he wouldn't admit it aloud, there was a part of him that felt grateful for the distraction. Spending Thanksgiving alone would have been lonely, but spending it helping others, that was something he could live with. Finally, after nearly 3 hours of relentless effort, Jack straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. "All right," he announced, turning to face the family. "Give it a try now." Richard climbed into the driver's seat, turning the key in the ignition. For a tense moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sputter and a groan, the engine roared to life. Cheers erupted from the group as the kids jumped up and down, clapping their hands in delight. Sarah rushed forward, tears streaming down her face as she hugged Jack tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "You have no idea how much this means to us." Jack patted her gently on the back, embarrassed by the display of gratitude. "Just doing my job," he said modestly, though he couldn't suppress a smile. For the first time all day, he felt truly warm. Not because of the cocoa or the exertion, but because of the simple joy of knowing he'd made a difference. As the family prepared to leave, Richard handed Jack a business card, insisting he stay in touch. Jack tucked it into his pocket without looking at it, too tired to think much of it. But as he watched the SUV pull away, its taillights disappearing into the snowy dusk, he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was far from over. Little did he know the ripple effects of his kindness were only beginning to unfold. The drive back to his garage was quiet, the kind of silence that settles in after a long day filled with unexpected challenges. Jack's mind replayed the events of the evening like a movie on repeat. The stranded family, their gratitude, and the hours he'd spent fixing their car under the freezing sky. It wasn't often that he found himself reflecting so deeply about something as routine as helping someone in need. But there was something different about this particular encounter, something about the way they carried themselves. The subtle elegance in their interactions and the genuine warmth of their appreciation lingered in his thoughts. As Jack pulled into the driveway of his garage, he glanced at the dashboard clock. It was nearly 9 p.m., far later than he'd planned to finish up for the night. His stomach growled faintly, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since lunch, a sandwich hastily scarfed down between oil changes earlier that day. But despite the gnawing hunger and the fatigue weighing down his limbs, he felt strangely content. There was satisfaction in knowing he'd done something meaningful, even if it came at the expense of his own comfort. Stepping out of the truck, Jack stretched his stiff muscles, wincing slightly as the cold air hit him again. He grabbed his toolbox from the bed of the truck and headed inside, flipping on the overhead lights. The garage sprang to life around him, its familiar scents of grease and rubber mingling with the frosty breeze that swept through the open door. As he set the tools down on the workbench, his eyes landed on the business card Richard had handed him before leaving. He picked it up absent-mindedly, turning it over in his fingers. The card was simple yet elegant, cream-colored paper with crisp, black lettering. On one side it read, Richard Bennett, CEO of Bennett Enterprises. Below that was a phone number and email address. Jack froze, staring at the words as if they might rearrange themselves into something less shocking. CEO? He blinked a few times, then flipped the card over. Surely this couldn't be the same Richard Bennett whose name occasionally appeared in headlines or local news stories. Bennett Enterprises was one of the largest philanthropic organizations in the country, known for funding scholarships, building schools, and supporting struggling communities. Not exactly the kind of company you'd expect to find stranded on the side of the road in Maplewood. Jack shook his head, chuckling softly to himself. Well, I'll be damned, he muttered, setting the card down on the counter. The pieces started falling into place now. The expensive yet understated SUV, the refined mannerisms of Richard and Sarah, the way they spoke about their work without ever explicitly saying what it was. They weren't just an ordinary family, passing through town. They were people who could afford private jets and chauffeurs, yet here they were, relying on a small-town mechanic to get them back on the road. It struck Jack as both humbling and ironic. Curiosity got the better of him, and he pulled out his phone, typing Bennett Enterprises into the search bar. The results poured in almost instantly. Articles about charitable initiatives, photos of sleek office buildings, and interviews with none other than Richard Bennett himself. Jack scrolled through them slowly, taking in the details. In every picture, Richard looked polished and composed, wearing tailored suits and exuding confidence. Yet earlier that evening, Jack had seen a completely different side of him, a man who was vulnerable, anxious, and deeply grateful for help when he needed it most. It made Jack think about how easy it was to judge people based on appearances or assumptions. Here was someone who had achieved incredible success, yet he hadn't hesitated to ask for assistance when he was stuck. And not only had he asked, but he'd also shown immense humility and kindness in return. Jack couldn't help but admire that. His thoughts drifted back to the conversation they'd shared while he worked on the car. Richard had mentioned being involved in helping people, though at the time Jack hadn't given it much thought. Now it all clicked. Everything Richard and Sarah had said about wanting to make a difference suddenly took on new meaning. Their gratitude hadn't been exaggerated or performative. It had been sincere, rooted in a shared understanding of the importance of compassion and support. But beyond the revelation about who Richard really was, Jack found himself reflecting on his own life. For years he'd gone about his days quietly, keeping to himself and focusing on his work. He didn't seek recognition or praise. He simply did what he believed was right. Yet tonight, he realized that those small acts of kindness, the repairs, the sacrifices, the willingness to lend a hand, had ripple effects far beyond what he could see. Helping the Bennetts hadn't just saved their holiday, it had reminded them of the value of humanity in its purest form. Lost in thought, Jack wandered over to the old recliner tucked into the corner of the garage. It was worn and patched in places, but it had been his late wife's favorite chair, and he'd kept it as a reminder of her presence. Sinking into it now, he leaned back, letting the weight of the evening settle over him. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white. The quiet was peaceful, almost meditative, giving him space to process everything that had happened. He thought about Emily too, and how proud she would be of him if she knew what he'd done today. She'd always admired his ability to stay calm under pressure, and his unwavering commitment to helping others. Maybe he'd tell her about it when she came home for winter break. Or maybe he wouldn't. Some things didn't need to be said aloud. They just needed to be felt. Before heading home, Jack tidied up the garage, putting away tools and sweeping the floor. As he locked up for the night, he glanced once more at the business card sitting on the counter. Something told him this wasn't the end of the story, that somehow, this chance meeting would lead to something bigger. But for now, he pushed the thought aside. All he wanted was a hot meal, a warm bed, and perhaps a moment to savor the quiet triumph of having made someone else's day just a little bit brighter. The days following Thanksgiving passed quietly for Jack, blending into the usual rhythm of his life. He returned to work at the garage, fixing cars and chatting with customers who came in for oil changes or brake repairs. The memory of the stranded family lingered in the back of his mind, but he didn't dwell on it too much. After all, helping people was what he did. It wasn't something he expected to be rewarded for, nor did he think about it as anything out of the ordinary. Life went on as it always had, predictable, steady, and uneventful. That is, until one chilly December morning when a delivery truck pulled up outside his modest home. Jack was sipping his first cup of coffee, standing by the window in his kitchen, when he noticed the large brown box being unloaded onto his porch. Confused, he set the mug down and grabbed his coat, stepping outside to investigate. The driver tipped his hat politely before climbing back into the truck and driving off, leaving Jack alone with the mysterious package. Curiosity piqued, Jack carried the box inside and placed it on the dining table. It was heavier than he'd anticipated, and the label bore no return address. Just his name and address typed neatly in bold letters. His brow furrowed as he opened it carefully, unsure of what to expect. Inside, nestled among layers of protective wrapping, he found several smaller items, a thick envelope, a plush blanket embroidered with the logo of Bennett Enterprises, and a handwritten note on high-quality stationery. Jack unfolded the note first, recognizing Sarah's handwriting immediately. It read, "Dear Jack, we can't thank you enough for your kindness on Thanksgiving Day. You may not realize it, but your actions meant more to us than words can express. That night, you reminded us of the importance of compassion and humanity, especially during times when we feel most vulnerable. Please, accept this small token of our gratitude. We hope it brings some warmth and comfort to your home, just as your generosity brought warmth to ours. If there's ever anything we can do to repay your kindness, please don't hesitate to reach out. With heartfelt thanks, Sarah, Richard, and the kids." Jack felt a lump rise in his throat as he reread the note several times. There was something deeply personal about the words, as if they'd been written not out of obligation but from a place of genuine appreciation. Setting the note aside, he turned his attention to the envelope. With trembling hands, he slid it open and pulled out its contents, a letter and a check. The letter was from Richard, typed but signed by hand. It began by thanking Jack once again for his selflessness, and explained how their encounter had inspired them to reflect on their own mission to help others. Then came the part that made Jack's heart skip a beat. The check inside was made out to him for an amount so large that he had to sit down to process it. The sum was enough to cover Emily's remaining college tuition, with plenty left over, to ease some of the financial burdens Jack had been carrying for years. For a moment, Jack simply stared at the check, unable to believe what he was seeing. This wasn't just money. It was freedom. From late-night worries about bills, from cutting corners to make ends meet, from the constant pressure of trying to provide for his daughter while living paycheck to paycheck. Tears welled up in his eyes as he thought about how this gift would change their lives. For so long, he'd felt like he was treading water, struggling to keep his head above the surface. Now it was as though someone had thrown him a lifeline. But the surprises didn't stop there. Along with the check, Richard included an invitation to attend a gala hosted by Bennett Enterprises in early January. The event was described as a celebration of community heroes, ordinary individuals whose acts of kindness had made extraordinary impacts. Jack's name was listed alongside others who had been recognized for their contributions, and the invitation emphasized how honored they would be to have him join them. At first, Jack laughed nervously at the idea of attending such a formal event. Him, a mechanic in grease-stained jeans walking into a room full of wealthy philanthropists and influential figures? It seemed absurd. Yet as he read through the details again, he realized that declining the invitation felt wrong. These people had gone out of their way to show their gratitude, not just with money but with respect and acknowledgement of his efforts. Turning them down would feel like rejecting the very essence of what they were trying to convey. That everyone has value regardless of their background or profession. Over the next few weeks, Jack wrestled with mixed emotions. On one hand, he was overwhelmed by the generosity of the Bennetts and the opportunities this gift presented. On the other hand, he couldn't shake the feeling of unworthiness that crept in whenever he thought about accepting such a significant gesture. Wasn't helping others supposed to be its own reward? Shouldn't he have done what he did without expecting anything in return? These questions swirled in his mind as he called Emily to share the news. Her reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. "Dad, this is amazing," she exclaimed, her voice brimming with excitement. "You deserve every bit of it. Don't even think about turning it down. You've worked so hard for everything. And now you finally get to breathe a little easier." Her words resonated with him, easing some of his doubts. Maybe this wasn't about deserving or not deserving. Maybe it was about allowing himself to accept help when it was offered, just as he'd done for the Bennetts on Thanksgiving night. Slowly, he began to see the situation differently, not as charity but as a reminder that kindness creates connections, bridging gaps between people who might otherwise never cross paths. As December wore on, Jack decided to use part of the money to expand his garage. He hired 2 local teenagers to assist him, giving them valuable experience and a steady income during the winter months when jobs were scarce. He also started offering free repairs to families in need, knowing firsthand how stressful it could be to deal with car troubles without the means to fix them. Word spread quickly around Maplewood, and soon, people were lining up outside his shop, eager to support the mechanic who had become a symbol of goodwill in the community. Despite the busyness of the season, Jack couldn't stop thinking about the upcoming gala. He knew he needed to find something appropriate to wear, but his wardrobe consisted mostly of flannel shirts and worn-out jeans. One evening, while sorting through old boxes in the attic, he stumbled upon a suit that had belonged to his late father. It was slightly outdated, but with a bit of tailoring it fit surprisingly well. Standing in front, insignificantly holding the fabric, felt like reconnecting with a piece of his past. A reminder of where he came from and how far he'd come since then. On New Year's Eve, as fireworks lit up the sky over Maplewood, Jack sat by the fireplace reflecting on the whirlwind of events that had unfolded since Thanksgiving. What had started as a simple act of kindness had transformed into something far greater, touching not only his life but the lives of countless others. He thought about the Bennetts, their humility, their gratitude, and their desire to pay it forward, and realized that he wanted to do the same. By the time January rolled around, Jack felt ready to step into the unknown. He packed his tailored suit, polished his shoes, and drove to the city where the gala was being held. As he walked into the grand ballroom filled with elegantly dressed guests, he felt out of place, but not uncomfortably so. Instead, he carried with him a quiet confidence, knowing that he belonged there just as much as anyone else. After all, he had earned his place not through wealth or status, but through the simple yet profound act of lending a hand to those in need. And as he shook hands with Richard and Sarah later that night, exchanging smiles and heartfelt words, Jack understood something important. Kindness isn't measured by how much you give, but by the impact it has on those who receive it. In helping the Bennetts, he had unknowingly sparked a chain reaction of generosity that would continue to ripple outward, inspiring others to do the same. The night of the gala arrived, and Jack found himself standing outside a towering glass building in the heart of the city. The structure gleamed under the soft glow of streetlights, its windows reflecting the bustling energy of the crowd gathered at the entrance. Limousines lined the curb, their engines idling as elegantly dressed guests stepped out onto the red carpet. Photographers snapped pictures, their cameras flashing like fireflies in the crisp winter air. Jack adjusted his tie nervously, feeling distinctly out of place among the sea of tailored suits and designer gowns. He had borrowed his father's suit for the occasion, carefully pressing it the night before to smooth out any wrinkles. Though it was slightly dated, the fabric still held a quiet dignity that suited Jack's personality perfectly. His shoes were polished to a shine, and he'd even trimmed his beard, a rare indulgence for someone who usually prioritized practicality over appearances. Despite his efforts, however, he couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong here. This world of glitz and glamour was so far removed from the grease-stained floors of his garage that it might as well have been another planet. As he approached the entrance, a valet offered to park his old pickup truck, which looked comically out of place next to the luxury cars surrounding it. Jack hesitated for a moment, then handed over the keys with a sheepish smile. "Take good care of her," he joked, earning a chuckle from the young man. Inside, the opulence only grew more pronounced. The grand ballroom sparkled with chandeliers hanging from the ceiling like constellations, casting golden light across, tables adorned with pristine white linens and crystal centerpieces. A string quartet played softly in the background, their melodies weaving through the hum of conversation. Jack wandered through the space, taking it all in. Servers moved gracefully between clusters of guests, offering trays of hors d'oeuvres and flutes of champagne. He accepted a glass of sparkling water instead, holding it awkwardly as he tried to blend into the crowd. Most of the attendees seemed to know each other, exchanging greetings and laughter with an ease that made Jack feel even more like an outsider. Still, he reminded himself why he was here: to honor the spirit of kindness and community, values that transcended wealth or status. It wasn't long before Richard and Sarah spotted him. They approached with warm smiles, their eyes lighting up as they greeted him. "Jack, you made it," Richard said, extending a hand. Jack shook it firmly, noticing how different Richard looked compared to the man he'd met on Thanksgiving night. Gone was the anxious father stranded by the side of the road. In his place stood a confident leader radiating charisma. Yet, beneath the polished exterior, Jack could still see traces of the vulnerability he'd witnessed weeks earlier. "We're so glad you could join us tonight," Sarah added, her voice filled with sincerity. She introduced him to several other guests, explaining how Jack's act of kindness had inspired them to refocus their efforts on supporting everyday heroes within their communities. Each person thanked him profusely, their gratitude genuine and heartfelt. For the first time that evening, Jack began to feel less like an imposter and more like someone who truly belonged. During dinner, Richard took the stage to deliver a speech. As he spoke, Jack listened intently, captivated by the passion in his voice. Richard recounted the story of their Thanksgiving ordeal, painting a vivid picture of the cold, desolate road and the mechanic who had sacrificed his own holiday plans to help them. "That night we learned something important," Richard said, his gaze sweeping across the room. "We learned that true greatness isn't defined by titles or achievements. It's defined by the willingness to extend a helping hand when it's needed most." The audience erupted into applause, and Jack felt a flush of embarrassment creep up his neck. He hadn't expected this level of recognition, let alone to be singled out in front of such a prestigious crowd. But as he glanced around the room, he saw nods of agreement and smiles of admiration directed his way. It dawned on him that his actions, though small in his own eyes, had resonated deeply with others. People craved stories of hope and humanity, reminders that even in a world often driven by competition and self-interest, there were still individuals willing to put others first. After the speeches, the event transitioned into a mingling session. Guests flocked to Jack, eager to hear more about his work and experiences. Some were philanthropists looking for ways to support grassroots initiatives. Others were journalists hoping to share his story with a wider audience. Jack answered their questions humbly, deflecting praise whenever possible. "I'm just doing what anyone else would do," he insisted repeatedly, though deep down, he knew that wasn't entirely true. Not everyone would have braved the freezing temperatures or sacrificed their own comfort to help strangers in need. What set him apart wasn't extraordinary skill or talent, it was a choice. The decision to act with compassion, even when it cost him something. One conversation stood out above the rest. A woman named Margaret, a retired teacher turned community organizer, approached Jack with tears in her eyes. "Your story reminds me of why I fell in love with teaching," she said, her voice trembling. "You've inspired me to start a program that connects local businesses with struggling families. If you can give your time and energy to help people, you don't even know, surely I can find ways to make a difference too." Her words struck a chord in Jack, reinforcing the idea that kindness has a ripple effect. Every action, no matter how small, has the potential to inspire others to act. In turn, by choosing to help the Bennetts, he had unknowingly planted seeds of change that were now beginning to sprout in unexpected places. As the evening wore on, Jack found himself relaxing, enjoying the camaraderie and shared sense of purpose that permeated the room. He laughed with newfound friends, exchanged contact information with people eager to collaborate, and allowed himself to bask in the warmth of human connection. For the first time in years, he didn't feel weighed down by loneliness or doubt. Instead, he felt buoyed by the realization that his life and his choices mattered. When the gala finally drew to a close, Jack stepped outside into the cool night air, his mind buzzing with ideas and possibilities. The city skyline stretched before him, a tapestry of lights against the dark sky. As he climbed into the valet-parked pickup truck, he couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed since that snowy Thanksgiving evening. Helping the Bennetts had not only transformed their lives, but also ignited a chain reaction of generosity and goodwill that extended far beyond Maplewood. Driving home, Jack replayed the events of the night in his mind, marveling at how one simple act of kindness could lead to such profound outcomes. He thought about the people he'd met, the conversations he'd had, and the promises he'd made to stay connected and continue making a difference. And as he pulled into his driveway, the familiar sight of his garage greeted him like an old friend. It was here in this unassuming little space that everything had begun, and where it would continue. For Jack, the gala wasn't just an acknowledgement of what he'd done, it was a call to action. It was a reminder that every day presented opportunities to create ripples of positivity, to lift others up and to leave the world a little better than he found it. With renewed determination, he resolved to keep paying it forward. Not because he owed anyone anything, but because he believed in the power of kindness to transform lives, including his own. And so, as he locked up the garage for the night and headed inside, Jack carried with him not just memories of an unforgettable evening, but also a renewed sense of purpose. Little did he know, the best was yet to come. The weeks following the gala seemed to pass in a blur for Jack. Life returned to its usual rhythm, fixing cars, chatting with customers, and keeping his garage running smoothly. But there was an undeniable shift in the air. The ripple effects of that one snowy Thanksgiving night continued to spread, touching lives far beyond what Jack could have imagined. What started as a simple act of kindness had blossomed into something much larger, transforming not only his own life, but also the community around him. Jack wasted no time putting the resources he'd been given to good use. With part of the generous check from Richard and Sarah, he expanded his garage, adding a second bay to accommodate more vehicles and hiring additional staff to help manage the growing workload. 2 local teenagers, both struggling to find steady jobs after high school, became his apprentices. They were eager to learn, and Jack took pride in teaching them the skills he'd honed over decades of hard work. In return, they brought energy and fresh perspectives to the shop, creating a lively atmosphere that made even the toughest days feel rewarding. But it wasn't just about expanding his business. Inspired by the conversations he'd had at the gala, Jack launched a program called Wheels of Hope, offering free or discounted repairs to families in need. Word spread quickly through Maplewood, and soon, people began showing up at his garage with stories of financial hardship, medical bills, and unexpected setbacks. Each repair gave Jack a chance to listen, to connect, and to remind himself why he loved what he did. Whether it was fixing a busted radiator for a single mother juggling multiple jobs, or replacing worn-out brakes for an elderly couple on a fixed income, every job felt like another step toward making a difference. The impact of Wheels of Hope extended beyond the mechanics of repairing cars. It created a sense of unity in Maplewood, inspiring others to join in. Local businesses donated supplies and materials while volunteers organized fundraisers to support the initiative. Even the mayor stopped by one afternoon, praising Jack's efforts and encouraging other townsfolk to follow his example. "You've shown us all what it means to lead with compassion," she said during her visit. "This town is better because of you." As spring approached, Jack noticed subtle changes in his own life as well. For years, he'd carried the weight of grief and loneliness, retreating into his work as a way to cope. But now, surrounded by newfound friendships and a renewed sense of purpose, he found himself opening up in ways he hadn't thought possible. He reconnected with old friends, joined a weekly bowling league, and even started volunteering at the local food bank on weekends. These small steps helped fill the void left by his wife's passing, reminding him that healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant finding joy again, even amidst the pain. Emily, too, noticed the change when she came home for spring break. She marveled at how busy the garage had become, laughing as she teased her dad about finally becoming famous. But beneath the jokes, she saw the deeper transformation, the light in his eyes, the bounce in his step, and the way he spoke passionately about his work. "I'm proud of you, Dad," she told him one evening as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "You've always been my hero, but seeing you inspire so many people, that's next level stuff." Her words brought tears to his eyes, though he brushed them away quickly, pretending it was just allergies. Deep down, he knew she was right. Helping the Bennetts had set off a chain reaction that had touched countless lives, including his own. And while he still missed his late wife terribly, he felt closer to her than ever before, as if her spirit were guiding him through this new chapter. In early April, Jack received a letter from Bennett Enterprises inviting him to speak at their annual conference. At first, he hesitated, unsure if he was the right person for such a prestigious platform. But Richard assured him otherwise, explaining that his story was exactly what attendees needed to hear. "People are hungry for authenticity, Jack," Richard wrote. "They want to see real examples of kindness in action. You're living proof that ordinary people can do extraordinary things." With some encouragement from Emily and his friends, Jack agreed to share his story. Standing on stage in front of hundreds of people was nerve-wracking. But as he began speaking, he realized how much he wanted others to understand the power of small acts of kindness. "I didn't think twice about helping that family on Thanksgiving night," he said, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "To me, it was just the right thing to do. But what I didn't realize until later was that kindness isn't just about the moment. It's about the ripple effect. One kind gesture can inspire someone else to pay it forward, and then another, and another, until we create a wave of positivity that touches everyone it reaches." The audience erupted into applause, many rising to their feet in admiration. Afterward, dozens of people lined up to thank him personally, sharing their own stories of kindness and resilience. Some promised to start similar programs in their communities. Others simply expressed gratitude for the reminder that even in tough times, humanity has the capacity to shine. By summer, Jack's influence had grown beyond Maplework. News outlets picked up his story, highlighting Wheels of Hope and the broader movement it had sparked. People from neighboring towns began visiting his garage, seeking advice on how to implement similar initiatives. He traveled occasionally to speak at events and workshops, always returning home with a renewed appreciation for the quiet strength of his small-town roots. One particularly memorable trip took him to Chicago, where he toured the headquarters of Bennett Enterprises. Walking through the sleek offices and meeting the team behind the organization's charitable efforts, Jack felt a deep sense of pride, not just in what he'd accomplished, but in the connections he'd forged along the way. Richard and Sarah welcomed him like family, introducing him to employees who had been inspired by his story to volunteer in their own communities. Over dinner, they reflected on how far they'd all come since that fateful Thanksgiving night. "I never expected any of this," Jack admitted, raising his glass in a toast. "All I did was fix a car. But now, looking back, I see how much bigger it was than that. It was about trust, compassion, and believing in the goodness of people, even when you don't know them." As the months turned into years, Jack's legacy only grew stronger. Wheels of Hope expanded to include partnerships with schools, churches, and nonprofits across the region. His garage became a hub of activity, not just for repairs, but for community gatherings and outreach programs. And though he remained humble, refusing to take credit for the widespread impact of his actions, those around him knew better. They saw the man who had chosen to help a stranded family on a cold holiday night, and in doing so, had ignited a movement that showed no signs of slowing down. On Thanksgiving Day, several years later, Jack stood in his garage, watching as volunteers bustled around preparing meals for families in need. The space buzzed with laughter and chatter, filling the room with warmth despite the chilly weather outside. As he looked around at the faces, some familiar, others new, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. This was what life was all about: connection, compassion, and the belief that even the smallest acts of kindness could change the world. And as he raised a cup of coffee in silent thanks, Jack couldn't help but smile. That snowy Thanksgiving night had been the beginning of something beautiful, a testament to the power of humanity to rise above circumstances and remind each other that we're never truly alone.